So welcome. I'm Jerry Carboni, part of the festival organizing committee. This year's festival is made possible by the generous support of our festival sponsors, Brattleboro Community Television, the Stepansky Family Trust, the Vermont Humanities Council, and Poets and Writers. We would also like to thank our advertisers and we encourage you to support them, as well as the festival. We have a donation box. I would also like to add our thanks to the Vermont Italian Cultural Association for supporting this talk. VICA is mostly present in Burlington and Montpelier, especially in the Barry area with its strong history of Italian immigration in the marble and granite industry. They offer wine tastings, Italian classes, book discussions, bocce tournaments, as well as a Zoom program on obtaining your Italian dual citizenship. So please check them out at vermontitalianculturalassociation.org. I've printed their latest newsletter, and I'll have it available for you to peruse at the front desk. Festival is run entirely by volunteers, but has very real expenses, as you've heard this weekend, I'm sure. So we encourage you to make a donation to one of the donation boxes sometime this weekend, or you can use the QR code on the small business cards that we have at the donation box. So please take a moment now to turn off the bings, bongs, thuds of your smartphone. Feel free to use it to take photos and share them widely on social media. So if you are here to listen to our murder mystery authors talk about their fantastic books, then you're in the right place. Sarah Stewart Taylor and Juliet Grams are no strangers to our literary festival. Sarah was here for our second festival in 2003 to talk about her first book, Artful Death, in the Sweeney St. George series, which had 4 titles. Sarah went on to write a second mystery series called Maggie Darcy that also included 4 titles. Her newest book, Agony Hill, the beginning of a new series, is centered on the small historic village named Bethany in northern Vermont. One might conjure up the image of Bing Crosby and White Christmas. Not so. Sarah has garnered awards and nominations such as the Agatha Award, the Dashiell Hammett Prize, and the Sue Grafton Memorial Award. I know she likes sheep and blueberries as she raises them on her farm, and I know she also enjoys strolling through cemeteries to read headstones, which is something I like to do. Juliet Grams attended the festival in 2019 with her first novel, The 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna. Her second novel, The Lost Boy of Santa Chionia, takes place in a small remote village in the region of Calabria, located in the toe of the Italian boot. Juliet is a winner of the Ellery Queen Award from the Mystery Writers of America, and she is also editorial director at Soho Press in New York. Her ancestry is from the region, and this is something that I share with her as well. In fact, 2 of her characters' names are in my ancestral tree, Romeo and Pangallo. Okay, so we have a small town in northern Vermont called Bethany and a small village in southern Italy called Santa Chionia. Ah, you say, no way there is a connection. I suggest you hold judgment until you have read both books. Their similarities will resonate. Agony Hill and Santa Chionia take place in the early 60s. Agony Hill represents the immense change coming to Vermont with the 2 great arteries of interstate highways literally paving their way through the mountains and bringing new people to the area. A disruption that shakes the area to its core. One of these new strangers is a young detective seeking a new life after the death of his wife. The other newbies are back to the land types who live on communes. The Lost Boy of Santa Chionia depicts a region in decline in the 60s. There is a depopulation of the small villages of southern Calabria, the poorest region of Italy, as the Chioniti immigrate to America or move to northern Italy for jobs and other opportunities. There's also a young American outsider with new ideas who comes to Santa Chionia to establish a nursery school. Of course, the other thing that ties the books together are the unsolved murders and missing people. Where does the evidence point to solve these crimes? Can it be found outside the closed villages or beyond their boundaries? The Italian mafia code of silence is called la omertà, which permeates the minds of the Chioniti. Yet among these Yankee types in Bethany, it is also present in its own Vermont form. Please welcome Sarah and Juliet again to Brattleboro. You can hold your questions until after their talks. We will pass a microphone around so others can hear your questions. And of course, afterwards, the authors will happily sign their books. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much for coming. This is one of my favorite literary festivals, and I think we got sort of the perfect weekend for it. And I'm really grateful to all of you for coming inside on such a perfect weekend and listening to us talk about mysteries. So I think this will be a fun conversation. If you haven't read Juliet's book yet, you will find just an incredible treasure trove of beautiful writing and history and the human comedy and human tragedy. It's just a terrific, terrific book. And I'm so excited about kind of finding these links that Jerry referred to between our books, between these, this very interesting time period all over the world, and the way that it manifested in these small towns that are undergoing different kinds of change, I think you'll see. So Agony Hill is the first in a new series. And for those of you who don't know me, the other series that I've written have all sort of come out of my love of place, my love of specific place. My first series, which was about a young art historian who specializes in gravestone art, was set in New England. And the first book in the series actually was set in a fictional Vermont town, very closely based on Cornish, New Hampshire, and the Cornish Arts Colony, which was sort of the vehicle that brought my family to Vermont and New Hampshire. My great-grandmother was a concert pianist who was a member of the Cornish Arts Colony and lived just down the road from Maxfield Parish and Augusta St. Gaudens. And so in that novel, I was sort of channeling that family history. And also, I think, exploring exploring change coming to small towns. I mean, when I look back at that book, that's really what I was looking at. And my second series, the Maggie D'Arcy series, is set mostly in Ireland, Long Island and Ireland. And those books really, I think I have a very close connection with Ireland. I lived there and I went to graduate school there. And, in many ways, I think those books were my way of exploring, sort of re-exploring a place that had been very important to me many years later. I lived there in my 20s and, had a lot of fun. And 20 years later, as a parent and someone who had suddenly very adult concerns, I think exploring that period of my life and remembering what it had been like to be a young person in Ireland was just really, really fun. And now with Agony Hill, I think I'm still very close to the writing process. And so the question of why the 1960s, why Vermont, those are questions I'm still exploring and I think still figuring out how to answer. But my best guess is that I chose 1965, August of 1965 is when Agony Hill is set, because it's a period where so many people have said to me, people who were living in Vermont at the time, so many people said to me, that was when everything seemed to change. That was when everything seemed, it was like a hinge. And before that, things kind of felt one way, and after that, things felt a different way. And of course, there were many, many reasons for this. One of the big ones was the coming of the interstate highways, 89 and 91. I live in the Upper Valley, just about an hour north of here. And, for us in 1965, it really was this feeling of the two interstates were approaching and they were going to cross in White River Junction. And if you look at the newspapers from the time and you talk to people who, I think who were sort of over 40 in 1965, there was a huge amount of angst and worry about what the interstates would do to our small towns. There were letters to the editor about who's going to come up on these interstates. These interstates are going to allow New Yorkers to just drive up in 4 hours, and what will they bring with them? And there's all of this worry and anxiety. And then on the other hand, there was a lot of excitement and a lot of sense of the opportunity that the interstates would bring. I found some wonderful articles from the Valley News, my local paper, about White River Junction was going to become this metropolis. There would be skyscrapers in White River Junction because so many people would be driving through on the interstates. And so it just felt like this period of intense change, an incredibly dynamic period in our state's history. August of 1965 was when the legislature was just finishing the reapportionment process. So some of you probably remember that before 1964, when the bill was passed, each Vermont town had one representative. And there were places like Brattleboro and Burlington that felt this was a little bit unfair because they had much more population than the town I live in, Heartland. And so the reapportionment process sought to create districts where you would have multiple representatives in some cases who would more closely represent the population. And this was also very anxiety producing. And if you read the newspapers from that time, there's a lot of upset about these new districts. And so as I was sort of researching this period of Vermont history, I just found all of these things that I wanted to kind of put in the backdrop of my crime fiction story. And one of my favorite ways of doing this research was to go into newspaper archives and to look at the stories that people were reading. And I thought it would be fun to remind some of you and tell others of you what was on the front page of the Brattleboro Reformer in August of 1965. What was going on right here in Brattleboro? So, as you probably remember, the Vietnam War is really heating up, and I was amazed at how much real estate Vietnam took on the front page of pretty much every newspaper in August of 1965. There were, daily reports of losses and battles. Draft quotas were being doubled that summer. Army Reserve, Vermont Army Reserve battalions were going to Fort Knox to prepare for possible deployment at some point in the future. So it was just everywhere on the front page of the Brattleboro Reformer. In LA, the LA riots were going on, and it was fascinating to read with hindsight now the way that they were covered. Was, in many cases, very insensitive, I would say. Reapportionment battle. It was announced that Brian Warren and Anthony Barazinski would be the first two representatives from Brattleboro to run for these new districts. Probably some of you know. Yeah, it sounds like some of you know some of these people. And then one of my favorite things about reading these old newspapers is the way that they acted almost like a sort of coffee shop counter. There was so much social news that you could get from newspapers in this period. And the social columns, which ran in the Brattleboro Reformer and every newspaper in the state, were written by almost entirely by women. And many of these women were just absolutely delightful writers. These columns were lively. They had real color. and they told your neighbors what you were up to. So, for example, in the Brattleboro Reformer on August 13th of 1965, an item, word has been received that Mrs. Fred T. Juliet has suffered a fractured hip in a fall at York Village, Maine. So her neighbors were informed that this had happened, so that, presumably so they could write to her and help out the family. And, all of the social columns have in common this sort of idea that it was everybody's business, what you got up to, who was visiting you, how, was your sister-in-law visiting from Baltimore for Thanksgiving? It would be in the newspaper. So, reading the newspapers was just such a wonderful way of learning about this period and getting the details that I needed for the book. Agony Hill, as I say, is set in the hot summer of 1965, and it begins with Franklin Warren, who is, as Jerry said, a Boston homicide investigator who has suffered a tragedy, and for reasons that we don't quite understand at the beginning of the book, has decided to come to Vermont and take a job with the Vermont State Police. And the Vermont State Police at this point was relatively new. It was only founded in the 40s. And so, something that I learned while I was doing research and talking to retired troopers was that, I think now they have very nice green cars and they look very professional. But in the 1960s, they were still sort of getting established. And, I talked to retired troopers who told me stories about the barracks being in old car dealerships because that was what they could afford, and sort of repurposing vehicles to be used as cruisers. And it was also a really exciting time in terms of investigative procedures. And so when my fictional detective, Franklin Warren, arrives, he's sort of coming in on a professionalization in a lot of ways of the Vermont State Police's investigatory capacity. And he sort of helps with that. So he's called up to a suspicious fire and begins to investigate. And pretty soon he has a lot of questions about the family of the farmer who died in the fire, the farmer's neighbors. And he has a lot of questions about his next door neighbor, Alice Bellows, who is a woman of a certain age who has returned to her hometown after being widowed, and who he begins to discover has connections in the intelligence world. Alice's husband was a diplomat with connections to intelligence, and she dabbled, shall we say, in intelligence gathering during her marriage. And so I really had fun creating this character of, I have to be careful because I have described her as an older woman of 55 when the book starts, and I'm 53 this year, so I have to be very careful about this. But I really had fun sort of learning the history of women who there were women, obviously, who signed up with the OSS and then the CIA in the World War II and post-World War II years, but there were also a lot of women who sort of dabbled. And a great example who you may have heard of is Juliet, of course, who, when her husband was stationed abroad and she was working as a secretary, sort of did a little bit of freelance and a little bit of intelligence gathering here and there. And there were, there were many women like that. And so I really had fun creating Alice sort of in that mode. So I'm going to do a short reading, and then I'm going to let Juliet talk about her wonderful book and her research. And then hopefully we can have a little bit of a conversation about some of our 1960s research and just how we put these books together. So I'm going to read to you right from the beginning. There's not a lot you need to know. Franklin Warren has just arrived in Bethany, and he's unpacking his boxes. It took 3 hours to unpack the rest of the boxes. The movers had brought the bed and bureau up the stairs the night before, and now he muscled the bookcases into the parlor and unpacked the books into them. He was organizing utensils and pots and pans when there was a knock on the door. A teenage boy now stood exactly where the basket had been. He had light hair shorn close to his scalp, and he was wearing dungarees and a dirty collared shirt that had seen better days. He had a malnourished, haunted look about him, as though he'd stepped out of life, a ghost from one misery or another, a flooded river, Dust Bowl migrant camps. "Mrs. Bellows says there's a phone call for you. Fire up on Agony Hill. She's holding it since there's no phone there," the boy muttered. Warren had to lean forward and listen closely to catch the words. These Vermonters had a funny way of talking, their mouths rolling over the ends of their sentences. Agony Hill? None of it made any sense to him. "Thank you. I'll follow you?" The boy didn't answer, but turned and walked briskly down Warren's steps and around the side of the house. The house next door, the Farnham house or the Bellows house, was a large white Greek revival, elegantly maintained, with a broad snowy porch and black shutters on the windows that looked out over the large almond-shaped green that comprised the center of the town of Bethany, Vermont, Warren's new home. The boy unlatched a high side gate and let Warren through. It wasn't until he had closed the gate behind him and started hustling up the stone path toward the back of the house that Warren looked around him. He had entered paradise. The house was backed by a huge garden, the tall, trimmed hedges forming an impenetrable border around the outside, and rows of flowers and vegetables and fruit trees forming intricate spirals inside. Running water could be heard from somewhere inside the plot. A floral scent wafted on the air. "Do you live here?" Warren called up to him. The boy turned around, shocked. "I help Mrs. Bellows in the garden," he said, as though Warren had greatly offended him. And I'm just going to skip ahead. They go into the house, and Warren picks up the telephone. "Hello?" Tommy Johnson's voice came down the line. "Warren? Tommy here. Sorry to throw you into the soup before you've even unpacked. There was a fire at a farm in Bethany last night. It's out, but they're sifting through what's left, and they've got a body. I thought it'd be a good way for you to meet some of the local folks. It'll be your jurisdiction anyway." "All right," Warren said. "Where do I drove down from Montpelier this morning. I'm at the barracks now, but I'll meet you at the field with the bull, the one looking at the mountain. You'll see. The boy will tell you. Bye-bye." The connection ended, and Warren replaced the receiver on the wall. "Thank you very much," he said to the boy and the woman, though neither of them acknowledged him. He stood there for a moment, looking through the doorway at one end of the kitchen into a graceful sitting room or living room. The green silk chairs and settee were grouped around a low wooden table piled with neatly arranged books. There was an air of cool gentility that confused him. Who lived here? Who was responsible for the garden? But the boy had already started heading out the back door, and Warren had no choice but to follow him, asking, "Could you tell me how to get there? He said there's a bull." At the side gate, the boy wordlessly stepped aside to let him pass. Finally, he said, "Go out that way," pointing to the way Warren had come into town on Route 5. "Take a left on County Road, go 2 miles. You'll see the church's bull standing in the field looking at the mountain. Turn up there. That's Agony Hill." He shut the gate behind him, disappearing from view without another word. Warren headed back toward what he supposed he ought to start thinking of as his own house, feeling very much in exile, as though after being ushered into Eden, he'd now been turned out. And I'll leave off there, and we'll hear from Juliet.
It's been such a treat the last couple of days because Sarah was kind enough to send me her book in advance. So I'm prepping for, your leaves and your beautiful countryside. And I'm reading this charming, charming mystery. And I'm just so excited to be here and to hear in your presentation about the local news. I learned a lot about the local news last night at a local bar. I won't get into it now, but I know there's some very interesting people in the audience today. Thank you all for being here. Thank you especially to the Brattleboro Literary Festival. It's my second time here, as Jerry mentioned. For us authors, these festivals can be really overwhelming or a lot of work, and you don't go back twice unless you really like it. And it's because you guys are awesome. So I'm so grateful to be here. My book is The Lost Boy of Santa Chionia. It's set in 1960, and the main character is named Francesca. She is a 27-year-old Barnard graduate, and she's going to change the world. And she's living in southern Italy with this idealistic vision that she's going to help bring education and hygiene to these very impoverished southern Italian villages. She's working for a nonprofit organization, and that's her mandate. And while she's there, there's a massive flood that knocks over the village post office and reveals a skeleton. So this sort of draws her into a very ill-advised amateur detective arrangement where she's trying to help local women in the village figure out if their missing men who are immigrants to the United States may or may not be this body that's under the post office. That's the story. But before I tell you a little bit more about the book itself, I want to tell you a family story. I promised someone here I would tell a Boston Italian diaspora story. So it's 1903, and we are in the Italian East End in Boston, and we have a delightful young married couple. They are named Emma and Victor, okay? Emma she was born in the United States, to Italian parents. Her dad is a construction magnate. So he came over with the first wave of immigrants, very wealthy, and he's now a scion in the Boston area. And he has brought over many stonecutters from Italy who work for him, and they build Boston. They build the banks, they build the sewers. It's great. One of these stonecutters is Victor. Victor works hard. He does real well for himself. He marries the boss's daughter. It's a charming story. He leaves stone cutting behind, and they open a general store which caters to Italian American needs. And it's just, it's all lovely. They have 4 beautiful children. And now we're back to that night in 1903 when Victor never comes home. And in the morning, when Emma goes looking for him, she finds that the safe is empty. And Victor is never heard from again. That is the end of Victor's story. It's not a made-up story. This was the story of my father-in-law's grandfather. So my father-in-law, growing up, knew that his grandfather had been a scoundrel who abandoned the family in total ignominy and stole all the money, left his grandmother to suffer, raise these children on her own in a time when that was very difficult for women. It caused a lot of problems I won't get into. Here's the thing. Do we know, in fact, that Victor was a scoundrel? Like, what data do we have? I am trained to ask this question because for the last 10 years, I have been doing a lot of research in the Italian American diaspora. For my first book, Stella Fortuna, which I know some of you have read, thank you, that was a fictionalization of my grandmother's life story. And I was trying to create her life in the 1920s and 30s in southern Italy, which is a time that is not written about. There was a lot of illiteracy. People were not telling their stories in their own voices. I had to rely on interviews. I was lucky. I met nonagenarians and centenarians who remembered their passages for me. Their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren have shared their stories. I've conducted more than 100 interviews in that diaspora just for that one book. And I already knew before I had written Stella what this book was going to be, because that story about that disappeared immigrant man who was never heard from again, he wasn't just in my family and in my husband's family. He was in like 85% of these interviews mentioned this Uncle Dominic who sailed away and was never heard from again. We talk about Uncle Dominic with heartbreak, with anger, with melancholy. There are a lot of different forms of this story, but part of it is we don't know whether to mourn this person. Were they a victim of exploitative labor? Because you all know being an immigrant is so dangerous, right? Were they a victim of organized crime? We Italians, we're famous for our organized criminal syndicates, but, they're everywhere. And, specific to our community at the turn of the century in these very dangerous immigrant years, we had black hand syndicates that were operating on immigrants. Your immigrant visa probably came through a mafia organization. If you opened a business, you were paying protection to a mafia organization. No one had hands clean here. You had to have been involved or you didn't move forward. Or were they in fact scoundrels who left their families and didn't want to raise their kids anymore? We can't know. It's like you've lopped this branch off the family tree and we don't know how to move on. And we don't know where our missing cousins are. Like, do they exist? Are they in Argentina and we just haven't found them yet? And this I find that this theme, it throbs through a lot of our family histories. We have this yearning to connect with our origins, in part because we're looking for our missing relatives. I have one more story, family story, and this one is mine. I have a 5-year-old son, and I gave him the name of my maternal grandfather, Serafino. It's an unusual name. My grandfather, Serafino, was amazing. I dedicated my first book to him because he was just a champ in every possible way. Hardworking, loving family guy. I just adored him. He was born in 1921. He, in turn, had been named after one of these lost uncles. So he had an uncle named Serafino, the first Serafino, who had emigrated to the United States and was working in coal mines in West Virginia when he was killed in a tragic accident in 1914, when he was only 17 years old. And so, my grandfather was born 7 years later, and he was given his name in homage. And, that's how Italian families do things. It's a sweet story, right? But that sad immigrant story about the dangerous labor, coal mining, construction work, railroad, these things that our ancestors did, they were very, very dangerous. It's not the end of the story. So Stella comes out. One of the things that happens if you publish a book is you talk to a lot of people you never would have met otherwise. And some of them turn out to be new friends, and some of them turn out to be relatives that you didn't know you had. And they write to you on the internet and they say, like my now third cousin, Jim, who is spectacular. You will see I have thanked him at the end of this book. Jim is an amateur genealogist, and he's very, very talented. He's been trying to solve a mystery in his family tree, which I was not able to help him with. Although we tried, that's a different story. But he said, he wrote to me and my mother with a whole battery of attached newspaper articles one day. And he said, hey, by the way, I figured out what really happened to your Uncle Serafino. He did not die in a coal mining accident. He was murdered. If I had my slideshow, I would show you the articles because I want you to see these words that we had to see. He was shot in the head by his best friend, allegedly for having an affair with the best friend's wife. Here's the thing. I mentioned he was 17, right? The best friend and the wife were 26. I'm not saying it's out of the realm of possibility that was true, but it seems to me that this was more like a sort of, uncle and aunt caretaking when he was coming over to work in the States. That was a very common arrangement we had. Also, the newspaper articles go on to interview a lot of witnesses, all who say he was a very upstanding young man. He never would have done anything untoward. The killer, a very upstanding man, never, exhibited jealousy or violence, So all of these people saying they were having trouble believing the way things looked. The killer was taken into custody and was kept in the local jail in this town in West Virginia, where for a month he was awaiting trial, and he was overcome with guilt, and he ended up hanging himself after a month in the jail cell with a belt that had been taken away from him before he was locked up. And finally, the third piece of these news articles were explaining how the case had been put to bed by a local judge who had developed a reputation in this area for busting black hand syndicates. He had cracked down really hard on Italian-American mafias that were operating in the Italian community. So, okay, reading between the lines, what do I know? Was my uncle's best friend caught up in the mob, and then my uncle was taken out in the crossfire, and then the mob silenced him afterward? Was my uncle a mafioso and his best friend got taken out in the crossfire? I know one thing for sure. My sweet and innocent 5-year-old boy has this guy's name. Okay, so this is what we say about how family trauma takes 4 generations to work its way through, right? I mean, like if we'd gone one more generation, maybe we never would have known. These are the questions that are in our past, and I find them so very provocative. I find the adventures that these missing men went through to be I want to know. I want to be able to answer those questions. And then also, I've been a crime fiction editor now for 20 years. So as I was working with this material, I was like, this is a murder mystery, guys. I got to write a murder mystery here. And that's what I did with The Lost Boy of Santa Chionia. I chose to set it in 1960, which I hope we'll get to talk about right after this. Really interesting time, as Sarah was saying, a lot of change coming to a lot of different places. Also because I got to use as the main character an actual historical woman, a writer named Anne Cornelison, a Vassar graduate who had lived in southern Italy working for Save the Children in the 1950s and 60s. And her memoirs were a really precious resource to me when I was doing research for my first novel. And I thought, hey, who better positioned to get involved in what's none of her business in a small town than this well-meaning outsider who also has access to things like census records and tax records, because her charity has to be able to look at financial stuff to decide how they're going to allocate their funds. So I'm just going to read you the very first page, and then we'll have our conversation. My father used to tell me that growing up meant understanding who was at fault wasn't what mattered. What mattered was who had to pay the consequences. Some people never grow up, Francesca, he'd say, and when I remember his words, I still hear his voice, a nasal baritone one might not expect from such a large man. Some people grow old still pointing their fingers or waiting for justice to bring down its hammer. But finding a culpable party doesn't fix a problem. A grown-up is someone who knows when to take action and who knows how to manage consequences. I inherited my father's fondness for aphorisms. I scrutinize myself through their lenses, even if I don't entirely subscribe to the aphorisms themselves. I've often wondered, for example, if my father's brand of grown-up ever puts away the guilt they accrue for those consequences they somehow know how to manage. I've been plagued of late with the urge to tell the story of the year I grew up, the story of what happened in Santa Chionia that winter of 1960 to 1961, when I was 27 years old. I was a blue stocking with big dreams for building a better world, one needy child at a time. My training had prepared me to weather many forms of calamity, but not, it turned out, evidence of cold-blooded murder. When the time came for that, I had to wing it. I've waited almost too long to make a record of these events, in part because I have been haunted by my role in them. I could have taken the true story of the lost boy of Santa Chionia to the grave, the way so many good Calabrian women have taken their dirty secrets. Women like Chica Casile, like Emilia Volontà, like Donna Adelina Alvaro. But I am not a good Calabrian woman. I'm an American. And we Americans, culturally denatured as we are accused of being, sometimes struggle with concepts like honor and tradition. I've decided I'd rather dishonor myself and come clean now that the price of the truth is mine alone to pay.
So we both love answering questions. Ask away.
I have one for you.
Sure.
I want to know, so when you were picking, you have two main perspective characters. One is male and one is female. And for me, writing about the 60s and women's points of view in the 60s, that was a big draw for this era for me. Yeah. It's like a period when laws are changing so rapidly. In Italy, definitely, women have just gotten their citizenship, but we're still stuck in a world where divorce is illegal, for example. People don't have agency over their own bodies. Conversations we're still having now. We're not done having, but I thought it was so interesting that, the Alice character, who you have, the way that you've picked a character who's kind of relying on or leaning into feminine archetypes to do a job that is very much beyond the Ken she's pretending to live. How did you pick her, I guess? I'm really interested in Alice. I'd love to hear about Alice.
Yeah. So Alice is, as I say, she's 55 in 1965. So born in 1910, which is the year that one of my grandmothers was born. And, I think Alice is very much based on women who I know in my Vermont town, and I know that they exist. They probably exist right in this room, and I know that they exist in Brattleboro. And, it's women who, if they had been born maybe 15 years later, would be running the things that they serve on boards for, if that makes sense. So in my town, the people who actually run the town are the women who serve on all of the boards and who run the Ladies' Aid Society and who are there in informal ways to prop up their communities and to make sure that if somebody passes away, the family gets the food. And if, somebody needs money, that it's made known to people who have money that a donation would be really helpful right now for this family. And, I think I love that sense of, of living at a time when everything is changing, as you say, and women like Francesca, who are in their 20s, have all of these doors opening for them. And, I think women like my grandmothers had to find other ways to be powerful. Yeah. And so I very much envisioned Alice sort of in that mode. And of course, some of those women ended up finding power within the mainstream too. But Alice is actually, there's a way in which her privilege prevents her. She's part of a very sort of, circumscribed world, I think. And I want to ask you about Francesca, because I think you created such a, she's not perfect. She has flaws. And I think you sort of drew out, this idea of like wanting to save the world, and the journey that she's on in this book is learning all the ways in which that might be misplaced. Yeah. And so, talk about how did you envision her? She's such a wonderful, sympathetic character, and yet she's not perfect.
Thank you. I'm still stuck on what you said about women finding other ways to be powerful. I'm turning that over. That was so much, Francesca is the perspective character. Yeah. And of course I put so much of myself into her point of view and what she wants from the world. But when I think about the book, I think about my secondary female characters because they're the ones I got the most preoccupied with. Right. We know that everyone's looking in Santa Chionia, everyone's trying to figure out who this lost boy is, but the women who were left behind by these missing men, these wives or mothers or daughters who were forced into, marriage or prostitution to get by, or who don't, they don't know where their children are. All of these women who are so disadvantaged in the structure of the patriarchy and have to find ways to either be powerful within the system. That is such a, that is it. I want to write more books about that. You've really put your finger on that energy. Yeah. So Francesca, I knew this, as I mentioned, I knew the plot, right? I knew what was going to happen. I knew who was going to be murdered and how, and I knew the complexity of all, I planned what was going to happen, but I hadn't decided who was going to tell the story when I started writing it. I'd been researching it since 2017, and then, the pandemic happened. And I was like, hi, I'm stuck at home. Now is time. Now is the time to sit down and write the novel. And so it was June of 2020. I took a leave of absence from work, and I'm sitting there ready to plot this murder mystery about organized crime and exploitation and lost immigrants. And I was like, these are important things that I want to write about. But also, do you know what I want more than anything else right now is some kind of guiding star that makes me want to get up in the morning and makes me think that there's a path for someone like me in this very lost moment to continue to be a good person. Like there's hope for us. Like the structures around us are crumbling. Nothing is right. Like nothing is just. Everything is broken. What do I do? And I realized that I wanted joy. I wanted joy from the reading experience, but I also wanted to remember how to be a good person. Yep. And And so I think that plot that I thought I was going to write, it ended up shifting. And that's where I got Francesca,
Yeah,
right?
fascinating.
Francesca knows what's right.
Yeah.
And she really wants to do good. And the thing about what she knows is right is that she's not correct, right? She's living in a world where the rules don't match her rules and where she doesn't see a lot of the other angles. And as she learns the angles, the question for her is, can she figure out how to moderate her understanding of good and bad and right and wrong and do the right thing in the situation? Or is she going to be too calcified to be able to do the right thing there? I thought that was so interesting. And it really, that became my torch, you know?
Yeah. It's great. Yeah, no, and it provides some of the sort of funny moments, but also the really, I think the really revealing moments in the book where she's coming up against these customs and traditions that seem wrong to her, and she has to sort that out. Should we see if there are any audience questions? And then I have some more things I want to ask you too. Do you have any questions in the audience that we could answer for you? No. Well, I would love to ask you a little bit about your research process in Italy.
Okay, I would love to talk about that, but you asked me the last question, so we can talk about that. I did. I got to go to Italy a lot, and I ate a lot of food. But yeah, okay, you go, and then I have one for you.
You have a question. All right.
I do have a question, and I don't write fiction, I write nonfiction, but I think increasingly about the circumstances surrounding death, where there's mystery around. Oh, is it on?
The circumstances around a mysterious death, more or less, the role that it plays in storytelling and the significance of it, and why we care so much about like the story of your relatives, or if not really knowing, were they a victim, were they a perpetrator, right? You had various versions where in some cases they were a victim. Is it because we're so disturbed by the idea of somebody could take someone else's life and never have to face the actual consequences of doing so? And does that represent like an ultimate power? I could take someone's life and never face anything. Like, why is that such a preoccupation in storytelling? And what do you, in your own work, see as the significance of that mysterious death where there's too many questions?
Yeah, it's such a great question, because I think for anyone who writes crime fiction or crime adjacent fiction, we always get, I don't know about you, but I'm always getting that question of, why do you want to focus on this? Why this? And my answer is that I think as a fiction writer, one of the pleasures of being a fiction writer and of making up stories is that you get to explore sort of human character under extreme circumstances, right? So, most novels, whether or not it's a crime novel, there's some sort of inciting incident that sends the characters on a new path, and usually kind of reveals who they are and kind of tests their mettle in a way. And for me, a crime story or a murder mystery tests character under the most extreme violation of the social contract that you can do. And it's just really, really interesting to me to sort of, it's the one thing that you sort of can't really come back from, that you can't, that can't always be redeemed. And it's just fascinating to me. What about you?
I agree with everything you just said. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I work in crime fiction. I edit a lot of crime novels. I do believe that there's a fantasy element to crime fiction that makes it sticky. It's why we want to read it, right? And we know that going in, that a novel doesn't usually represent a real world case exactly. And part of the satisfaction is that within the frame of the crime novel, there is a hope for justice.
Yes.
So I live in a very small village in Rhode Island, and it's about, there's 1,100 people in my village, and in our kind of county area, there's probably like 8,000 total. I moved there 6 years ago, and we've had 2 murders in that time. And one of them was related to an opioid ring that bust went wrong, and the other was of domestic violence. And then those are real world murders. There's no happy ending, right? There's no justice in both cases. In the first case, the perpetrator, lost their business and is in jail, and in the second case, the perpetrator committed suicide after killing his wife. These are the things that really happen. When we write crime fiction, we get to that point of that aberration of the most fundamental human contract, but we delve into character and we delve into circumstance and we create a world where you can read about it and there can be a hope for justice. And I think that, different people read different genres for different escapist reasons. In romance, you're guaranteed a happy ending. I think with crime fiction, what you're guaranteed of is an interrogation of the status quo, right? Yep. And not all crime fiction promises you justice
or
delivers, right? But it's giving you the chance to get close to what hurts us the most and to look at it with that magnifying glass and perhaps find storytelling and redemptiveness in it. And it's one of the reasons I love working in this space. It's as close as you can get in an entertainment form to really looking at social issues that are so relevant to us.
Absolutely, yeah. I think some of the best sort of social commentary and political commentary, to some extent, right now is happening within the world of crime fiction. I don't know if any of you have read a writer named Attica Locke. She's one of my absolute favorite crime writers, and her novels take on everything that we're talking about right now. They take on social justice and corruption and poverty, and and to my mind, they do it in a way that is satisfying because you're also carried along on this incredibly sort of just exciting and interesting plot. So yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's a great question. It is a great question. Yeah.
S.A. Crosby and Tom Mullins.
Both.
Thomas Mullins are
Terrific.
really good where they deal with
Yep.
those things. I have not read your book, but I've read your book.
Thank you.
And it's got that mystery element, but it's so much more. I mean, we're dealing with society. The characters are great, like the landlady.
Yeah.
I mean, that relationship is just fabulous, and just the sense of protectiveness and the community not wanting to give information, and there's just so much more going on. Did that kind of develop around the mystery, and as you were writing it just kind of grew, or were those characters always there?
Oh my gosh. I don't even know. I've been, my process is that because I edit so many books all the time, I don't get a lot of time to write. So I spent 7 years working on this book, but the first 3 years were nothing but research and plotting. And you kind of you start reading in layers, and then your understanding of the world you're building, it stacks up. I can't even tell you really where I began or ended. It's funny. Today I'm like, oh, the origin story was this. This uncle, it turned out, was murdered, right? But to be honest, I learned about that story after I was about 2 years into writing this. So I don't even know where I started. I can't tell you. It just piles up and piles up. And I think, ideally, if you're a writer, you are writing a book that would only pile up in your head, and that's what makes it worth your time, So.
Yeah, but I really did love the landlady.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so the landlady, Francesca's landlady, is named Chica. She is 70 years old. She has a lot of axes to grind. She's really irascible, and if she was, in fact, inspired by an actual person, then my lawyers have advised that I say that she's entirely fictitious. So,
The disclaimer.
and if you've read the book and you know the incident with the prickly pear, I'm also told to say that this was also made up completely in my imagination and did not in any way happen to me in person.
So I do have a question about the use of the Greco language in in Calabria. Maybe you can explain a little bit about
Yeah,
that.
sure. So I said Santa Chionia is a made-up town like Bethany. Oh, we should talk about that next.
Made-up towns.
Made-up towns.
Yes.
And why set a crime novel in a
Why?
made-up town? But it is set in the Aspromonte Mountains, which is the very toe of the boot in Calabria. And if you speak Italian, you're like, Aspromonte. Monte means mountain. I know that one. What is aspro in Italian? It's not Italian, it's Greek. It means white in Greek. Those are the white mountains, just like here. Isn't that nice?
That's so
connection
cool.
again.
That's so cool.
So, but that's the culture there. It is half Greek and half Italian. People in Calabria were all Greek speakers until 1600. So, it wasn't that it's a linguistic or ethnic minority. It's that everyone was Greek and they gradually Latinized because of globalization and movement, especially if the church was speaking Latin. And so there are still these very remote pockets in these villages that have stubbornly decided not to modernize, especially when you're in 1960. A lot of towns don't have any roads connecting them anywhere else yet. They were built defensively to avoid feudalism and especially colonialism and having to pay taxes. And then they developed their own internal systems of protection, which often devolved into organized criminal syndicates. And they also have these very intensely developed traditions, 1,000-year-old traditions of, religious rites, language, music, stuff you will never hear anywhere else, food you will never eat anywhere else. So very, very fascinating. And when I did go to Italy to research this book, I did get to talk to many members of the Greco community. Once I met one who introduced me to a bunch more, I got to do a lot of interviews. It's just fascinating. If you want further reading on that, I do have a reading list on my website, but I'd be really happy to tell you where you can learn more about them. They're really interesting.
Is the particular name of the mafia in Calabria probably Greco?
Yeah, so the
derivation?
name of the Calabrese mafia is the 'Ndrangheta, and people struggle with that word, but Indra, it starts with an apostrophe. Indra is andros in Greek, right? And geta means to struggle. So it's the men who struggle, or the men of honor, right? The men who struggle for honor. It's just Greek. It's a Greek name. It's not a coincidence that they have a Greek name and that they emerged in these do you remember the kidnapping of John Paul Getty III in 1970? That was sort of the first moment when they were front page news, that people realized that the syndicate existed. They were so remote and no one knew how to track them down. They couldn't find him. He was hidden for 5 months? And they're looking through the trees and caves and it's this very rural defensive mafia that ruled all of these people in this kingdom for a long time without the interference of the Italian government.
So fictional towns.
Yeah. Tell us
talk
about
about
where
fictional
did
towns.
Bethany come from?
So when I started writing the book, I considered just setting it in, Woodstock or Heartland, where I live, or in Windsor. And as I started writing, I discovered that there were certain things I needed to tell the story I wanted to tell. One of the big things about Bethany is that it has a very large green in the center of the village, in the center of the town. And so I wanted this sense of people living around the green, all kind of looking out their windows at each other, that communal sense of, running into people when you're walking over to the store to pick up your paper, but also that you're always a little bit under surveillance. And anybody who lives like in the center of town, that's the case. Your neighbors know what car is parked in front of your house, and they see who's going in and out. And as I sort of started writing it, though, I knew that I wanted other things. I wanted there to be a jail in town. I wanted there to be certain kinds of businesses. And so I just realized I needed to make it up. I needed to create something that was kind of a mashup of a bunch of different towns. And so if you read it, what you'll see, I actually, in the front of the book, I quote Tasha Tudor's picture book, Corgyville Fair, which was one of my children's favorite books. And she writes about a place called Corgyville, which is east of New Hampshire and west of Vermont. And that's sort of how I envision Bethany. It's kind of just like plunked in there between actual towns. And you'll recognize a lot of the other towns that are around it. So yeah, I think I just didn't want to get into trouble as well. I wanted to be able to kind of make up characters and not have people say, oh, I know who you based that character on. That's your neighbor or my neighbor. So, and what about you?
Well, it was interesting because the moment you're writing about too, it's not just that the interstate is coming through. It's also like the forensic procedure is changing, right? I mean, that's part of why Warren is there.
Yep.
So the town has its green and they've collected their gossip in a certain way, but the state trooper is being involved.
Right.
Like he has to, so Warren has to teach his protege how to fingerprint. Like that's all new, all this stuff is new. Yeah. And of course, there's probably people here in Vermont who remember who the actual state trooper, who Tommy was, right? You don't want to get in trouble with that person's children.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think in general, you want to give yourself space to be creative and to not sort of pull your punches when you're inventing characters, right? Because the best characters are people who are flawed and who are multidimensional and who feel real. And sometimes when you're very directly basing a character on someone unless you absolutely hate that person, you feel a little guilty giving them, human foibles.
So we're all friends here. We can keep secrets, and I'm sure that video recording isn't going to go anywhere, right? So is anyone in your book based on a real person?
Not 100%. Not 100%.
Cagey answer.
There are. I think there are a few characters who are maybe 80%, but only a few. Most of my characters are, some combination of some composite of. Characteristics from actual people and then things I just make up. Yeah. How about you?
I did. So my speaking role characters are all invented. I mean, the real Andromeda in the world is not nice. I didn't want to get mixed up with them. Yeah. But so I'm like, this is all made up. And that's honestly why I said it in a made up town, because people, I interviewed real mobsters. I don't want to have it look like I was talking about those people at all. Yeah. I've referred to the crimes that I've written in. None of them exactly match up to real crimes, but all of them are drawn from real things that happened. So I wanted that to feel real, but I wasn't responsible enough to stop myself entirely from putting real people in it. So there are a lot of Easter eggs in there. There's some walk-on characters. I'm going to share this because on my way down, I went to Barrie and I visited the sculpture garden in Barrie.
Did you go to the museum?
I didn't have time. I know I do, but I knew about, Italian stonemasons. And of course I wanted to see it for those reasons, but reading about Elia Corti, who was the labor rights activist, he was a socialist and he was executed during a labor union meeting in 1903. And I know that, we use words now like communist or socialist because they sound softer, but a lot of those guys identified as anarchists. And there were, at this time, anarchists were really bearing the flag of a lot of these progressive movements in Italy as well, and opposing the rise of fascism, et cetera. So I have a real, actual, famous anarchist who's in here. Oh, he's only in there for one scene. He's a walk-on character. Yeah. His name is Santoro Maviglia, and if he's at the beginning, he's the one who brings the goat to Chica's house. So, great. But he was real. He was an anarchist in the town of Africo, which is a real mob-run town that inspired so much of the history I used here. And he just relentlessly, he had gone to jail for murder during the World War II era, and he ended up in prison, sharing a prison cell with Antonio Gramsci. And this guy, Maviglia, he couldn't read or write. Gramsci taught him to read and write and taught him about Marxism. Yeah. And so then he ended up becoming an anarchist and coming in. He was just like this progressive voice in this increasingly draconian town that became more and more entrenched in mob politics and run by, church corruption. And he kept fighting back. And after the town was displaced, he was shot a number of times. The mobsters tried to execute him. He never gave up. He was really a hero, a folk hero. So I gave him a walk-on part. And I admit that there are other walk-on parts too in the book, but I won't mention any of them now.
I'll have to look for them. Mm-hmm. Looks like there's a question back there. Yeah.
I think this is more a question for you, Sarah. This is first of a series, Agony Hill.
It is. I've just finished writing the second book in the series,
So,
which will come out next summer.
Given its time frame, and this is sort of a current topic around here, communes and back to land, does that they play a role at all, or do you know yet?
Yeah. So in the first book, because it's 1965, it's a little bit early for the real sort of bulk of the commune movement in Vermont. And so what I kind of wanted to explore was the post-war back to the land movement and kind of the first wave of homesteaders who came to Vermont in the 40s and 50s. And, my family is sort of within that history. I have this guy who is a little bit older than your typical hippie, and he's established a farm and has been living in town for 15 years, but he's very much sort of part of the back to the land movement, and is a bit of a rabble rouser in town, shall we say. And as the series, hopefully it will have a nice long life. And as it goes on, I'm really looking forward to kind of exploring the late 60s, early 70s establishment of communes, and just, all of the incredible people who that movement brought to Vermont. If you look at, the Vermont's legislature and the leadership of many of our state institutions, those leaders are people many of them who came to Vermont during that period. And it's really fun to kind of start really looking at the imprint made on our state by that time period. So yeah, there should be a lot more commune action in in future books. I know we're sort of getting to the time here.
Yes, we do need some time for book signing and
for
so
some
forth.
signing. Yeah.
So if I just I'd leave you with this quote from Gramsci, which I think applies to our age. Gramsci said, "The old world is dying, and the new world struggles to be born. Now's the time of monsters." Let's not think about November 5th too much.
What a note to end on. Thank you so much, everyone.